Hello and welcome to this podcast from the BBC World Service. Please let us know what you think and tell other people about us on social media. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
Life is full of choices. What did you pick to wear today? Do you drive or cycle to work? Should you eat that donut? Reply to that text? Take that job? Those are just a few of the 35,000 decisions we make every single day. Some mundane, some critically important. That works out at around one decision every 2 seconds. The most recent one you made being the excellent decision to listen to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service, the show that answers your science questions. I'm Caroline Steele, and this week we're tackling a question from Crowd Science listener David.
Hi Crowd Science, I'm David from the UK. My question is, how can we make the best decisions possible?
Thanks, David. So how can we make the best decisions? Is it by being smarter? Relying on our intuition and gut feelings? Or maybe it's by putting our emotions completely to one side? David's question feels especially relevant right now. As individuals and as a species, we face some incredibly important decisions. From how to deal with the pandemic.
The global community is faced with the threat of a new, highly transmissible variant of COVID-19, which requires urgent action.
To how to stop the climate crisis. If you're anything like me, it's easy to criticise politicians, bosses and friends for making bad choices. But how can you tell if you'd have made the right call if you were in their shoes? Well, thanks to psychology, it is actually possible to predict how good someone will be at making decisions. And a big part of it is to do with certain errors in our thinking that lots of us make when interpreting the world around us, known as cognitive biases.
So we study these biases by asking people questions about decisions they would make in specific difficult situations. And those situations are written so that they basically test whether you're able to avoid common decision biases.
Wendy Bruin de Bruin is Provost Professor of Public Policy, Psychology and Behavioural Science at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where she studies the role of cognitive biases in decision-making.
Would you like me to ask you one of those questions?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay. After a large meal at a restaurant, you order a big dessert, and after a few bites you find you are full and you would rather not eat any more of it. Would you be more likely to eat more or to stop eating it?
I'll definitely finish the dessert. Yeah, I'm not going to leave food on my plate.
And that is a decision that a lot of people make in that situation, because they find it difficult to stop eating the dessert that they have already paid for and that they have already chosen. But economists call this the sunk cost bias because paying for the dessert and choosing it is a sunk cost. That has already happened. Whatever you've invested is gone, whether or not you continue to invest, right? So now your decision is, so you've paid for this dessert. If you continue eating it, you may end up with a stomachache. If you stop eating it, you will have also paid for the dessert, but you will end up without a stomachache. So your future outcomes will be better if you stop eating the dessert.
Does that sound familiar? Maybe you've sat through a movie you weren't enjoying because you've already paid for the ticket. Or you might have stayed in a bad relationship because you've felt you've invested too much to leave. If so, then, like me, you're a victim of the sunk cost fallacy. And there are other biases that can trip us up too. Imagine walking into a supermarket to buy some yoghurt. There are 2 pots. One is 10% fat, the other 90% fat-free. Which one would you pick up from the shelf? They are, of course, the same, but the majority of people fall for something called the framing bias and choose the 90% fat-free option. We're often swayed when the same information is presented to us in different ways. Wendy measures how susceptible people are to these sorts of biases and uses her results to give them a score of decision-making competency. But how does that score match up to the choices we make in the real world?
Yeah, that's a good question, because what we're doing is we're giving people descriptions of hypothetical decision-making problems that they may never experience exactly like that in real life, right? So we ask people to self-report a large set of decision outcomes, including, for example, whether or not they have type 2 diabetes, which is the kind of diabetes that you get from making health decisions that are not good for you. We also measure whether, for example, people have stayed in the sun so long that they've developed blisters from sunburn, whether they've had to declare bankruptcy. And we find that people who are better at our decision-making competence test tend to experience less negative decision outcomes in their lives.
So if you get a better score, you really do tend to make better life decisions, leading to better well-being, health and relationships. So is it possible to ace this test? Well, there's something else Wendy found in her research that I find quite surprising.
Decision-making competence predicts the ability to avoid negative decision outcomes in real life, independent of intelligence. And decision-making competence is a separate skill. It's related to intelligence, but it's a separate skill. So being smart doesn't guarantee that you're good at making decisions.
Making decisions feels like it's about finding the right answer to a question. So it makes sense to think that smarter people would be better at it. Why isn't that the case?
So we can see that rational thinking and intelligence actually are kind of quite separate, independent qualities. You can be intelligent and you can learn to be rational, but you can also be intelligent and you just never pick up those critical thinking skills that are important for rational decision making.
That's David Robson, science journalist and author of The Intelligence Trap. He told me that history is full of loads of examples of intelligent people making poor decisions. It's not just that intelligent people are as vulnerable to decision-making biases as everyone else. Sometimes people actually make worse decisions because of their intelligence.
I think in specific situations, kind of their intelligence can work against them. It can backfire. And one reason for this is motivated reasoning. And that's when you're so attached to an idea that you kind of use your intelligence to rationalise that idea, to rationalise that belief. And you use your intelligence to kind of knock down any criticisms that might contradict your beloved belief. So one of my favourite examples of that is with Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes.
Sherlock Holmes is, of course, one of the greatest detectives in fiction. He's the epitome of logical thinking and deduction, and Arthur Conan Doyle puts those skills to good use, solving crimes in countless stories. But in his private life, Conan Doyle held some surprising beliefs.
So one of his strangest beliefs was this story of the Cottingley fairies. So these two schoolgirls, were probably bored one summer. They cut out some pictures of fairies from one of their favourite books and, pinned them together, placed them at the end of their garden and took some photos. They then showed them to some spiritualists and it got to Arthur Conan Doyle, who became like this huge champion for these girls and their story. He started drawing on like the latest ideas in physics of like electromagnetism to explain how perhaps they weren't visible in the usual wavelengths of light that humans can perceive, which could explain why we don't see them kind of fluttering about around us all the time. And in a way, he was using that great intelligence, that creativity to deceive himself so he could still cling to this irrational belief.
Fairies that are only visible in unknown frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum might sound a bit far-fetched, but it's not that far off some of the conspiracy theories we see floating around today. In fact, research shows that more intelligent people are actually more likely to believe in fake news and conspiracy theories. If you want to find out more, then please do dip into our back catalogue and download our episode of Crowd Science on conspiracy theories from BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. So if intelligence can't protect us from poor decision-making, then what can?
So I'd say the most important is humility. So, you can measure people's intellectual humility with lots of questionnaires that ask, how ready they are to admit that they're wrong, whether they're willing to accept the kind of limits of their knowledge. And time again, you find that more humble people form more rational beliefs and make more rational decisions. Interestingly, actually, humility can kind of make up for lower intelligence, even academically. So what you find is that obviously people with higher IQs tend to do better in academic tests, but actually people with a lower IQ but high humility tend to perform just as well, because essentially they're willing to put in the extra bit of work. They're willing to kind of accept where they need to correct their lack of knowledge, to correct their ignorance, and that over time can really add up.
Perhaps some really intelligent people are likely to be less humble because you've sort of spent your life being told how intelligent you are and you've succeeded, so it might lead to you being a bit less humble and therefore a bit worse at making decisions.
That's exactly it. So when someone has a perception of their own expertise, they become more closed-minded, so they don't kind of look for new information, essentially. It's like their knowledge becomes stagnant. That's a big problem, especially with things like politics or science, where there's always new developments that you have to react to. But some people just stop reacting because they think they kind of know it all.
So according to David and Wendy, being smart doesn't necessarily help us make good rational decisions. Actually, to make the best choices, we need to step back, open our minds, and avoid the trap of believing that we've got all the answers. There is something else that most of us depend on when making decisions, even if we're not aware of it. And research shows that it can be really valuable when it comes to making up our minds, even if it doesn't sound like it would be very reliable. I'm talking about intuition.
It's a type of knowledge that we know without knowing how. While we might reason through things with conscious awareness, intuition happens without us really knowing how, and without us, consciously going through the different steps to arrive at our conclusion or our knowledge.
This is Valerie Van Mullicum, an assistant professor at Coventry University in the UK, who studies gut feelings.
You might be driving on the road late at night, and so the visibility is poor, and then suddenly you have an intuition to watch out extra carefully for some reason, and you don't know why you have that intuition, so you watch out, and suddenly a cyclist without a light emerges out of the darkness or something like that. And so you hadn't noticed them consciously, but the subconscious processing that had been going on had picked up on something. Maybe you saw a tiny reflector in the distance and you didn't register it consciously, but subconsciously it happened. And because it was significant, it rang a bell. So, it might have triggered threat or danger or something like that, which is, an emotional process that then might have, for example, made your palms sweaty and made you go, oh, something's going on. And then you pay attention and then it enters conscious awareness.
That's so clever. And really useful. I mean, could literally be life-saving in that situation.
I think that's when intuitions can be really valuable. And because, evolutionary speaking, this is a great system of directing attention. So that's one area. Then one other area could be where you might have a lot of expertise. So, for example, doctors might have intuitions about a disease that a patient has, who presents certain symptoms without knowing why, simply because they can rely on so much experience and knowledge of their field. The subconscious processing or intuitive thinking that takes place without a conscious awareness is not restricted by our working memory. That means that it can make lots of different associations really quickly. And we don't have to rely on us consciously being able to make those connections.
I think I should make the point here that you can't always trust your gut feeling. If you have a hunch that you should put all your life savings on red in a casino, well, you should probably ignore that particular intuition. But in other situations, it can help you pay attention to stuff you hadn't noticed consciously. So, intuition can be a valuable way of drawing on memories or experiences. And to show you quite how important it is, let's take a look at what happens in a world without any intuition. I'd like to introduce you to my mum.
Some 15 years ago, I had a big car crash and severely damaged the front of my brain, as you can see from the scar.
Yes. Okay, so you had this car crash and it damaged your what's it called?
I don't know. You might have done the research.
It's the frontal cortex. Damaged your prefrontal cortex.
My right prefrontal cortex.
Your right prefrontal cortex, yes. And that, I think it's fair to say, has had a big impact on your life, yeah?
Only very major. That's all.
So how has it impacted your life?
I get overwhelmed very easily because I can't make decisions quickly. And I get no feel for what the answer should be, so get even more bogged down by trying to do the analysis, which makes the decision-making very slow. Before, you just knew what was right.
Yeah.
And now, I don't get that immediate instinct of what to do.
Okay, so what you said that was interesting is you said...
It was all interesting.
That was interesting. You're saying you've kind of lost your gut feeling.
Correct. No gut feeling.
I've seen firsthand what it looks like before and after someone, my mum, loses their intuition. It's odd because the brain damage doesn't seem to have impacted her analytical thinking in the slightest. She uses it all the time in her job as a maths teacher, but it's in other parts of her life where the lack of gut feeling really comes into play. So, what's going on in my mum's brain? And why does that mean she struggles with decision-making under pressure? David Robson again.
I mean, that's really fascinating. Sounds like your mum, resembles a kind of series of neurological case studies of people who had damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And these patients actually tell us something really important about the role of emotion in decision-making. So in general, we have quite a dim view of emotion in decision-making. We kind of think that they are going to lead us astray. Our emotions are something that should be ignored or suppressed if you're trying to be rational. But that's actually not the case, and these patients really show us why that is. And what the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has shown is that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is really important for the processing of emotion. So it's involved in forming these kind of physical reactions to events. So things like the racing of your heart, the butterflies in your stomach, the tension in your muscles when you're feeling nervous. And these are called somatic markers, according to Damasio. And he says that what happens is a kind of feedback loop where once you create those somatic markers and then you perceive them, that gives you this kind of intuitive gut feeling of what to do. Kind of an emotion or an intuitive gut feeling of what to do. And what these patients are lacking is that gut feeling. So they don't have this kind of emotional response to events to guide their decision-making.
That's so interesting, yeah. So my mum says she doesn't really have a gut feeling about anything, so she has to make all her decisions through analytical thinking. So if she ever makes a quick decision, she often makes the wrong one just because she's not got that gut feeling to rely on.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And what we find actually is that, like you said, people with damage to that area, they don't tend to score worse on measures of kind of intelligence, like traditional measures of intelligence, like IQ. Like they're very good at abstract thinking still. But their lack of ability to kind of process and read emotions does influence their decision-making in quite profound ways. They kind of often get stuck in this analysis paralysis because they don't have an emotion to kind of motivate them to make one choice or another. They just get stuck making no decisions at all. Or when they do make decisions, it's like they're just misguided because they haven't been guided by an emotional response. So often they're just focusing on a completely irrelevant piece of information. Because often our emotions are useful for decision making. They can absolutely lead us astray. But in general, they're drawing on all of our non-conscious knowledge, maybe stuff that we haven't thought about deliberatively, but they're providing this kind of intuitive signal that often we should follow. So I kind of think of our emotions as a bit of a compass. A compass could be pulled in the wrong direction by like a strong magnet occasionally, but often, it's accurate. And the same goes for our emotions. Like often they're a useful piece of information to consider alongside all of the other more kind of analytical things that we might be thinking about before we make a decision.
So it sounds like my mum is missing this internal compass to point her in the right direction. I would say that explains a lot. I can think of several examples where her decision-making under pressure has been questionable. Memory number 1. There was that time when she was frantically tidying before having friends over and decided to clean an electric light switch with a wet cloth.
For some strange reason, I thought it was important to clean the switch. Unfortunately, I used a wet cloth and it worked very well for a while, and then I sort of electrocuted myself slightly.
I'm amazed you weren't electrocuted straight away. I mean, at least we have to say you were fine. Can you see now with hindsight that was a poor decision?
It might have been a poor decision.
Okay, memory number 2. So, I don't actually know the full story of this one, but I have a vague memory of it. This was more recent.
Oh, more recent?
Yeah. So you saw somewhere being burgled. You walked past a house that was being burgled. Is that right?
Yeah. I saw a guy climbing into a top window of a house. I believed he was a burglar. I ran into the garden and threw stones at the window to say, "Hey, you've been spotted, stop."
How did that go?
Well, nothing seemed to happen until he ran out of the front door. So I ran after him purposefully and got him in an effort to stop him.
But he got away in the end.
He got away in the end with the possessions of the people in the house, namely passports, driving licence, money, wallets.
Some people might say hero. I would say terrible decision. What would you say?
Hero.
So you would say you stand by that decision now?
No, it was stupid, but I can see why I made it.
For most people in that situation, emotions and feelings of potential danger would stop us from acting. But without that gut feeling, my mum wasn't afraid of intervening. Maybe it helped her to do what was right, or maybe she put herself at unnecessary risk. Either way, I think she'd agree she's a good example of how our gut feelings can really come in handy. So far, we've been looking at how we can make better decisions for ourselves. But have you ever noticed that it's a lot easier to give wise advice to a friend than it is to follow that advice yourself? In fact, there's a name for this phenomenon. It's called Solomon's Paradox, after King Solomon, the wealthy and wise monarch of Israel. He was known for making excellent decisions for his people. One day, 2 women came to him with a baby, both insisting that the boy was their son. To settle the dispute, Solomon ordered one of his guards to cut the baby boy in 2 so the women could have half each. The true mother cried out to stop the guard and give the child to the other woman. Of course, she wanted her son to live. Deducing the truth, Solomon returned the baby boy to his mother and sentenced the other woman to prison. A wise and judicious ruling. But the thing is, Solomon notoriously made terrible decisions in his personal life. He was greedy with his wealth and he married over 500 women, which, unsurprisingly, caused him a few problems.
Solomon's paradox is an asymmetry in decision-making or the quality of deliberation when you deal with other people's issues compared to your own issues.
This is Igor Grossman. He's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and he studied why we're often much wiser when it comes to other people's problems.
First of all, it's really ironic because ultimately you're often more motivated to think better about your own issues because they're your own issues. You also should know yourself better than others. So what does this asymmetry actually reveal? It often speaks to the possible psychological mechanisms that promote better or worse decision-making.
To investigate Solomon's paradox in experiments, Igor asks participants some tough questions. Like, imagine you're in a relationship and you've been together for years. One day, your partner comes up to you and admits they've been unfaithful. They cheated on you with your closest friend. How would you react? Okay, hold on to that thought. Now, imagine a friend comes up to you and says their partner cheated on them with a friend. How do you react now?
And then we look at people's reflections and we ask them do you need more information about the situation? You just learned about this. How about considering different perspectives on this issue? Empathy. Would you be willing to compromise for the sake of this relationship? And so on. So then we can compare whether it's your situation or it's a situation involving a friend. And what we often find, again and again, is that people, when they think about infidelity that involves them personally, one of the first things that comes to their mind is if this happens, it's a breakup. They're not very willing to consider perspectives. They're not very willing to seek more information. Whereas when it concerns a friend, they're much more likely to recognize limits of their knowledge and consider different perspectives than when it's their personal issue.
I can so see myself in that. I'm good at sort of dishing out advice to my friends, but I'm terrible at taking it myself. So what can we learn from Solomon's paradox?
It turns out that there is this phenomenon of self-distancing that accounts for it. So when naturally you distance yourself when reflecting on others' issues, and less so when you reflect on your own issues. And self-distancing helps you to see the bigger picture. It allows you to shift your perspective when you approach a decision from how you would normally, habitually approach it. And when you sort of simulate this distance then by asking people, for instance, via instructions, by talking to yourself in the third person or looking at yourself from a third person perspective, then it turns out that we often can reduce this asymmetry between decisions that we make for ourselves and decisions that we make for others.
When you say talking to yourself in the third person or self-distancing, what do you mean exactly? Like, is that something I can try right now? How would I do it?
So how would I feel? What should I do? You would, instead of that, you would say, how would she feel or how would they feel? What would they do? And that by itself is already sort of like puts you a little bit away because it's not natural, but also it creates linguistically this kind of third person angle.
Okay. Caroline's partner has cheated on her. How might she feel and what should she do? And if I said that out loud to myself, that might help me look at the problem and make a better decision.
Well, it depends on what you mean by better decision. And that's, of course, a tricky issue. Better is always context dependent. But it would certainly help you to maybe slow down a little bit, not react immediately. But in the context in which we have studied it, for instance, by looking at people's diaries, or we just sort of like ask them to recall situations that did happen to them in the real world with other people. Again, the effect is not huge, but under some circumstances, it seems like there is this benefit of taking a step back and looking at the issue that already happened to you in the third person. And so this is concerning decisions that actually did occur to people. So I am hopeful that it does help.
Igor's research shows that Solomon's paradox comes up again and again, but there is a way around it. Next time you're making a difficult decision, you might like to try talking it through in the third person and see if it helps. Maybe just not out loud if there are other people around. Now, arguably, when it comes to some of the most important decisions we face today, like how to respond to a pandemic or the climate emergency, we can't tackle them on our own. We need to make these choices as a group. So, how can we make better decisions when we're part of a team? To find out, I spoke to an expert in group behaviour.
My name's Anita Williams-Woolley. I'm an associate professor of organizational behavior and theory at Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School of Business.
So I'm wondering, why do we sometimes fail at making decisions in groups? Could you maybe give us your top 3 reasons?
Let's see, only 3. Wow, because there are so many. A lot of times when we're talking about a decision in groups, some people talk a lot. Some people talk not much at all. And it's not necessarily the case that the people who do the most talking know the most. So that's one of the reasons. The second is that we tend to all focus on what we call common information. If I mention a reason that I think we should do, X, other people are likely to pile on, and we're likely to talk a lot about certain parts of the decision and then not talk about other possibly very important parts of the decision. So that's the second. And then the third and related reason is that all of this means that there might be unique but very important details that never come to the surface. And so we just tend to overlook these things, and our opinions get more extreme as we reinforce each other's point of view. And then we all kind of agree that we're absolutely right, even when we're wrong.
Okay, so in your research, you look at how groups perform and you've come up with this idea of collective intelligence. What is that?
Yeah, so collective intelligence is the capability of a group to perform a wide range of different kinds of tasks or solve different kinds of problems in different environments. And some of these problems, they have to eventually decide which one solution is the best. Others, they're trying to develop lots of different ideas. And so they're really deciding how to go about doing the work and to get everybody to chip in and to think, creatively. And so one of the things that we find is important for collective intelligence is that we have a high level of participation and relatively equal participation from all the group members. Not at every moment, not for every task, but across the range of problems they work on. Because in order to really perform well, they really do have to have input from everybody.
Okay. So you've mentioned how groups do best and have a higher collective intelligence when people chip in evenly. What else? What other factors make groups more intelligent?
Well, certainly if you have individuals in the group who are good at picking up on social cues, especially nonverbal cues, so that they will help facilitate other people. So for example, maybe I'll notice you're not saying anything and I'll ask you, just in case you have a really good idea that we should be listening to.
Anita's work has also looked at who's in the group.
For example, when there's a good gender diversity, or even when there are, more women than men in a group, that's when we tend to see this more equal, fully engaged collaboration. And we also see an association with other forms of diversity, such as ethnic diversity.
I love that. Groups with more women and more collectively intelligent. Does that mean that the most collectively intelligent group is a group of all women?
Well, no, or at least not in most of our data sets. There's a benefit to having women in the majority, but to still have gender diversity.
Why is it that having more women up to a certain point makes a group more collectively intelligent? Because that's definitely not something we would think straight away, I don't think.
Well, it depends on who you ask, because sometimes I tell my friends that and they say, well, yeah. So having more women in the group is actually related to the factor we spoke about earlier with social intelligence, and that what we find in our studies, and this is true in other studies in this area as well, is that women on average tend to score higher on measures of skills related to social intelligence. And so by having more women in the group, you tend to raise the average on these kinds of collaboration skills.
It's interesting that factors to do with group dynamics are much more important than the intelligence of the individuals, which only has a modest effect. Another thing that doesn't seem to matter when it comes to performance is how the group feels about each other.
So it's not about people liking each other or being highly cohesive. And when we first measured this, we were sort of surprised by it. But over time, as we've seen this over and over again, what we see is that in some cases you can have a group of people who get along great, who are friends even, but they don't really push each other, right? They're not very focused on doing well, at the task at hand. Maybe that's unimportant to them. They're more focused on the opinions of the other people in the group. And you can have other groups where, maybe they wouldn't really be friends, but they actually work together quite effectively. And so I don't want to come across as saying, I don't think people should like each other. But it's not the main thing to focus on when thinking about what helps a group be collectively intelligent and to perform well consistently over time.
So Anita has some advice on how to maximise collective intelligence. If you're able to choose who's in the team, think about diversity and social intelligence, rather than just choosing your friends or even experts. And once your team is up and running, you need to make sure that everyone feels comfortable voicing their own opinion and gets the chance to speak. So, David, you wanted to know how we can make the best decisions. The research shows that first of all, you need to avoid some common biases. Is your judgment being skewed by the sunk cost fallacy or maybe the framing bias? And the next bit isn't necessarily about being smarter. Instead, it's about open-mindedness and intellectual humility, while also being aware of your gut feeling, if you have one, because it might be telling you something useful. And if all else fails, just take the advice you give your friends, rather than the advice you give yourself. David, I really hope that helps. Now the credits are all yours.
That's it from this edition of Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. This week's question was from me, David, in the UK. You can decide to send in a question of your own. Email the team at crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Now here's the winner of the BBC's first international podcast competition. And she's got a question for you.
I would love to share some of these letters. They mean so much to me and to my girls.
It all started with me asking my friends and family here in Kenya to write letters to my daughter, giving her advice and telling her about their experiences.
You make some mistakes along the way, and that's part of life. And that's what even makes just being a woman enjoyable.
And then I won the BBC World Service's international podcast competition. So we're making a podcast full of letters to daughters everywhere.
I'm writing to you because I know one day you'll have questions and want to know why.
The result is Dear Daughter, a brand new podcast from the BBC World Service. Anything else you want to leave us with? Anything you want to say?
To our daughters, always wipe front to back. So that...
Search for Dear Daughter, wherever you get your podcasts.